Good evening, and welcome to this public forum regarding North Dakota's initiated measure number 2. I'm Dave Thompson. I work for Prairie Public Broadcasting. I will be your moderator tonight. This community forum has been organized by the League of Women Voters of Bismarck-Mandan and is co-sponsored by Dakota Media Access. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization that promotes the informed participation of all citizens in their government. The League does not endorse or oppose candidates, political parties, or measures. Initiated measure number 2, if passed, requires a change to the North Dakota Constitution, and it proposes to eliminate the levying of local property taxes. The audience is invited to submit questions using index cards provided to you. Viewers at home can also phone in questions by calling this number, 701-667-3237, between now and 6:45 p.m. Central Time tonight only. That number again is 701-667-3237. No questions attacking the speakers personally will be used. This is intended to be a respectful exchange of ideas. Personal attacks should be avoided, and as the moderator, I will stop any such attempt. Our purpose this evening is to provide voters with information about how initiated measure number 2 will affect the people of North Dakota. Again, we would like a civil discussion and discourse tonight. Now let's meet our panel. For the proponents of Empower the Taxpayer, Robert Hale is the founder of Empower the Taxpayer. He's an attorney, entrepreneur, and the director of a public interest law firm. He's been a successful builder and developer operating single and multifamily housing, in addition to actively building and operating LLC, retirement and assisted living facilities in the upper Midwest. He's president of Spectrum Care, LLC, Vision Management Services, LTC Solution, LLC, and Oak Tree Decorating Center. Charlene Nelson and her husband of 26 years, Ross, have lived in North Dakota for 18 years. She homeschools her 3 boys and has a degree from Brigham Young University in Portuguese and history. She was the state chairperson of the Constitution Party for 8 years and led the petitioning to get 3 presidential candidates on the ballot in North Dakota. In 2001, she also chaired Protect Our Privacy, a citizens group that successfully repealed Senate Bill 2919. For the opponents, Keep It Local North Dakota, Ladd Erickson is the McLean County State's Attorney, a position he's held since 2003. Prior to that, Ladd served as the Assistant State's Attorney in Morton County. He graduated from the UND School of Law in 1994 after obtaining his undergraduate degrees from the University of Mary in mathematics and in Bismarck State College. Jonathan Gottfried is the Vice President of Governmental Affairs for the North Dakota Chamber of Commerce. Gottfried works with the North Dakota Chamber staff and members to develop and implement the organization's legislative agenda, monitor interim legislative studies, and determine the effects that state and federal legislation have on the business community in North Dakota. He holds a Juris Doctorate and Masters of Business Administration from the University of North Dakota. Prior to completing his graduate degrees, he received a Bachelor of Arts degree in Business Administration from the University of Northern Iowa at Cedar Falls. All right, each pair of panelists will now have up to 3 minutes to introduce their reasons for support or for opposition to measure number 2. So again, you have 3 minutes, and Empower the Taxpayer, the proponents, will begin.
Thank you very much. And thank you to the League of Women Voters for hosting this evening tonight. This is wonderful to see so many people who are concerned and want to learn more about this measure. We have been studying property tax for approximately 5 years and introduced this measure as a piece of legislation in the 2009 legislature. It was defeated, and it was amended then to become a study, and it was defeated as a study. And at that point, it became clear that our legislators had no intention of addressing the issues of property tax, not even studying the effect of property tax on the families in North Dakota. Why do we look at property tax? Because property tax, of all the taxes, is the most harmful. It is the most complex. It's difficult to understand. It's so convoluted in how it's calculated. And because of that, it's also the most easily manipulated. It's manipulated to benefit a certain few who get cuts or abatements at the expense of the rest of us who pay full price for our property taxes. It's also the most expensive. to administer. For administering, assessing, and the appeals process, it costs us about $50 million statewide just to administer this offensive tax. It's also an disincentive to businesses to either locate here or to expand, which is one reason why our local leaders always consistently offer property tax abatements whenever they want to spur the economy in their city or county. But it's also a disincentive to home improvement and to providing stable homes in neighborhoods, because families who want to improve their homes will find themselves penalized with higher taxes. It also keeps new families out of the home market. And so we have a lot of children now who won't be growing up in stable neighborhoods. Instead, they're in apartment buildings because their families can't afford the homes that they want. And bottom line is, it makes all of us renters. At the end of the day, if you don't pay your property tax, you lose it. It's totally unrelated to people's abilities to pay. When the income goes down, when you lose your job, you spend less, your sales tax will go down, your income tax will go down. But when we have hard times in our community, or you personally have a personal economic hardship, your property tax will always go up, regardless of your ability to pay. There are lots of good ways to fund government services, and we want us to look at those other ways and not put our homes at stake.
Thank you very much. Now the opponents. Keep it local, North Dakota.
Thank you, Mr. Thompson, and thanks to the League of Women Voters for sponsoring this forum. The political subdivisions across our state come in all shapes and sizes. All have varying degrees of demands on them from our citizens. The water boards around Devil's Lake have a whole set of challenges and expenses compared to water boards in the Badlands. Cities range in size from Fargo to our many small towns. We have 53 counties, all with many differences depending on population, the amount of roads they have, how much pavement they maintain, whether they operate a jail, what condition their buildings are in. Some have mostly full-time employees, while others rely on part-time or combined positions. The same can be said for our fire and ambulance districts, townships, school and park boards, and the many other political subdivisions that make up the 2,100 local entities that address basic government functions related to health, safety, education, and the well-being of our citizens. Simply, it is unrealistic, magical thinking to believe that some sort of uniform funding formula can be developed in Bismarck to address all of the case-by-case diverse needs and expenses from all areas across our state. Ignoring this reality by vesting centralized legislative control in funding over local government, Measure 2 is designed to take power and accountability away from both our citizens and our local governing boards. In so doing, the costs of government will dramatically increase, and I hope we get into detail about the cost of this tonight. Certainly, Measure 2 will create large tax increases in other taxes, potentially require taxes on services, and may likely create a greater use of special assessments, more than we're used to now. But for now, I would just like everyone to consider what passing Measure 2 would mean for our citizen legislature. Our legislature meets for 80 days every 2 years. That allows us to be represented by farmers and ranchers, business owners, doctors, teachers, and many other people from all walks of life. Measure 2 will require a professional, monolithic type legislature, meaning that only people that have no other commitments will be able to serve, because the legislature will be in a sort of perpetual state of special sessions dealing with local government budgets and needs. This is a drastic and very negative impact of Measure 2, and as the night goes on, I hope we have a chance to address the serious pitfalls and consequences of getting rid of our part-time legislature, in addition to all of the other problems Measure 2 creates. Thank you.
Thank you. Now we'll move on to the questions submitted by our sponsors, members of the League of Women Voters, our audience here tonight, and our viewers at home. Again, if you would like to call in a question, please use this phone number, 701-667-3237. You have until 6:45 p.m. Central Time tonight. Now, each side will have 1 minute to answer the question that I'll pose, with a 1-minute response from the opposing viewpoint. Please comply with our time restrictions so we can get to as many questions as we can tonight. Our timer will let you know when you're down to 30 seconds. then 10 seconds, and stop, but she doesn't have a hammer, so just be very careful. All right, our first question goes to the proponents, the Empower the Taxpayer folks. If Measure 2 should pass, what income sources will replace property taxes for local communities?
The measure is very clear that there are other state resources. There's oil, gas revenues, there's income and sales tax, there's gambling, tobacco, and a myriad other taxes that they can tap into. But what we'd like to see is the state, there have been research done that shows that the state has approximately $1 billion of waste in every biennium. And would like to see the state first do away with that waste. And that's what's so good about this measure, is it prioritizes spending. It says that first, we must fund K through 12 education. Second, we have to fund local government. And then whatever money is left over, go ahead and give to your special interest into this pork spending. But that essential government services should never come at the, that the special interest should never be fed at the expense of essential government services.
A response from Keep It Local?
Well, I think that speaks to the point of that this measure will throw our tax policy into chaos. It'll result in increases in other taxes, and it's not going to be the proposed tax cut that I think some people believe it will be. The money's going to come from somewhere, and that's going to come out of your pocket. As far as, and it's going to come at the expense of your local voice, of your local control, your ability to control what's going on in your local government, and we just don't feel that's a good idea.
All right, thank you. I would like to follow up with the Empower the Taxpayer folks. You mentioned that there was a study done that there's $1 billion worth of waste in state government. Who did the study, and can you point to some specific waste?
Yes, we invite everybody to go to our website, because everything we're talking about tonight, we have documented on our website, which is yesm2.com. And the study was done by the North Dakota Policy Council, and this was 2009 numbers. They're in the process of publishing their 2011 legislative session, which we suspect will have quite a bit more waste.
Do you have a specific example?
Why don't you give your...
Well, one example is North Dakota Higher Education's policy of subsidizing non-resident college students. No other state in the nation has a liberal policy as we do. We're giving $12,000 in education subsidies to 17,000 non-resident students every single year. That's almost $200 million. The Commerce Department itself has about $117 million annually that it gives away to some of the largest corporations in the world in cash grants. These are things that we don't believe should come at the expense of families.
For the Keep It Local folks, do you believe that there is $1 billion worth of waste in state government?
Mr. Thompson, if you torture any data long enough, you'll get it to confess and tell you what you want to hear. I'm sure there are things that can be cut in the state budget. There's things that when I read in the paper, I wonder why that would be expended. But one of the things you'll notice if you look on their website is that they're concerned about all these things that the state does. And then they propose a measure to give the state even more power over spending, which doesn't make any sense. It should be the opposite. If they're concerned what the state's doing with spending, then they should take and limit the state spending. Instead of that, they add all the local government burdens to that too, and it makes no sense.
I'd like to stay with the opponents of this and ask this question. Oil, of course, is a big revenue source right now, but is there enough oil revenue to accomplish what Measure 2 would like to accomplish? And if not, would taxes have to go up somewhere else?
Well, I think, you know, in the last election cycle, the citizens of North Dakota established a legacy fund. We've got money that's going into a rainy day fund already. And also, with this great oil development comes great impact. These impacts need to be paid for. These Western communities are feeling a great burden with this economic growth that we are getting. So to simply say that there's this great deal of surplus out there, a lot of that money has been allocated to address the many impacts that are going on out in the western part of the state. And I'd strongly suggest that the western people in North Dakota think about this measure, because those impact dollars are going to go away if this measure passes.
Would you like to respond from Empower the Taxpayer?
Go
When we talk about local control, one of the things we urge people to do is actually read the measure. About 90% of the people we talk to have never read the measure. The majority of people that are members of this coalition, we've called many of them, they haven't read the measure. You have to read it. The measure constitutionally guarantees local control to our political subdivisions, which currently doesn't exist. They have to do what the state tells them to do. As for K-12 education, the state already funds 70% of K-12 education. Nobody talked about losing local control. The 30% that is now funded with property tax revenue, it specifically says school boards have sole discretion to allocate the expenditure of this portion. That's true local control. Right now, school boards have no authority as to how they allocate a dime that they spend. DPI determines it. The same at the legislative or the political subdivision level.
This for the Empower the Taxpayer group. The measure says the legislature must fund legally imposed obligations. Can you point to definitions of what a legally imposed obligation is in state law? Would it be police departments? Would it be fire departments? Would it be schools? What would be the legally imposed obligations?
Yes, indeed. It's already written into state law what services cities and counties and townships must provide. And if you look at the North Dakota, again, it's all linked on our website. If you look at the North Dakota Tax Commission, they have 27 pages of what must be funded or can be funded by property tax. How many mills you can assess for each different item on there, the maximum, the minimum. And those are legal obligations. Those are already codified into law. There's stipulations set out in the state constitution that tells what cities and counties and townships must do. Those are legal obligations. It's really quite clear.
Would the Keep It Local folks like to respond to that?
Well, yes, first of all, I've read the measure many times, and it does destroy local control. There is a misinterpretation of what this is actually going to do when you say that there's no local control now. My county commissioners could double our tax rates if we thought we needed the revenue. That's in their control right now. And what the measure will do is take, for example, when a developer comes in, and we have that going on all over North Dakota with all of the building of homes and things, they come in and say, county, you need to develop a road system for us to get into our subdivision. And the county then has some expenditures to do, but is going to increase their tax base if that happens. So the county commissioners make that decision. If Measure 2 passes, the county commissioners are going to be in a position of saying, this isn't going to increase our tax base because there isn't one anymore. And we can't commit to the development here because we don't know if the legislature is going to agree to fund what we need to put into this. So it's the legislature will decide, not locally, but what gets funded on the local level. And that's why Measure 2 destroys local control, in one example.
This one is for both the proponents and the opponents. What state agency will be responsible for policing this if it passes?
This is going to be policed by the local jurisdictions. They're going to continue to provide the same budgets that they're doing now. The legislature is not going to go and determine the budgets of any political subdivision. That'll be done by the political subdivision, exactly the way it is done by all of our school districts. When the state took the 70% control, they left the budget determination up to the school district. As the measure says, specifically, it shall be fully and properly funded. Remember, this is a constitutional measure which sets out the policy. What's fully and proper will be determined as time moves along. We've already done that, for example, with our road system. Our state road department has determined the types of roads that are going to get built, the types of road that they're going to fund. So it's laid out. We have numerous examples across the board of how this is done. Thank you.
Well, I guess I'd challenge that if Measure 2 passes, you're going to have 2,100 subdivisions coming to Bismarck with their budgets in hand, looking for their budgets, looking for their money. I'd envision that there'd have to be some sort of department of local governments or something along those lines created, because the legislature is going to have a hard time handling this level of subdivisions coming in and getting their budgets reviewed. I just don't see how this doesn't expand government, especially when you've got all these subdivisions needing to get approval for their budgets. You can say that you can fully and properly fund something, but I think there's going to be a huge discrepancy on what fully and properly funded is, depending on who you ask. And if the legislature determines that, that's where your fights are going to come in, and that's where these subdivisions are going to have to come and argue in front of the legislature that this is what we need, and it's just unrealistic.
I will follow it up with a question that was submitted by the audience, and I'll read it as is and then my interpretation of it. How will a community like Mott, North Dakota have the opportunity to have its voice heard in the legislature for funding priorities versus a city like Fargo? You're talking about a city of several hundred versus a city of 100,000. So how does that work?
Right now, the way money is appropriated around the state is whoever gets the most votes, which is why we always talk about Fargo. Fargo has the most votes. They get to set the funding agenda for a large part. This gives constitutional guidelines that cannot be violated regardless of how many votes you might or might not have. This says that these legal obligations for Mott must be fully and properly funded despite what Fargo might or might not want. And we saw the same thing happen with public schools. We saw the smaller school districts fighting for their share of funding. And it was decided that it was not an equitable formula, and the legislature was directed to come up with an equitable formula. And they'll have to do the same thing now for local governments, by the courts, yeah.
That's a huge concern, because we have 3 legislators, everybody has 3 legislators, and I'm from a rural county, and my representation there is much less if Bismarck handles the funding. One of the problems with those rural areas is we have a lot of non-resident owners, and about $240 million a biennium of income that is currently taken off those properties is going to be lost, and North Dakotans have to make that up if this passes, because it shifts the cost of non-resident property owner burdens to residents either through sales or other taxes. So not only do you lose control, you also make up for other people that aren't going to have to pay taxes now, and you absorb those burdens.
This is for the Keep It Local folks. If $4.8 million from our audience, if $4.8 million is coming into the legacy fund per day, doesn't this meet those needs?
Well, the legacy fund, that money is put away until 2017, and even at that point, it needs to have a 2/3 legislative vote for approval to expend it, and it can only be a certain, I don't remember the exact percentage of the legacy fund can be expended at any one time. So to think that we can rely on the legacy fund to somehow fund this $1.6 billion outlay, I think it's a little unrealistic again. And that wasn't the intent of the legacy fund. The legacy fund was never intended to replace taxes. It was intended to be a rainy day fund, put some money away for later on if the oil runs out, when the oil boom stops. It was to fund our state at that point. It was to put the money away, not to use it for something like this.
Would you like to respond?
Would very much like to respond. Yes, $4.8 million is going into the legacy fund on a daily basis, but $9.6 million of the other part of the money coming in oil and gas daily is not allocated, is going into a fund that's now being squirreled away in 21 different accounts so that it isn't used to reduce our costs. Now, Measure 2 does not need oil money in order to pay for itself. We have an econometric study that's been done, and the state refuses to do one also, although it's been directed to do it, that shows that this will pay for itself by bringing in new economic development, just like our local economic development agencies do and rely on. It will raise more money than is lost in property taxes, so it funds itself. We don't even need the energy money, but we have tons of energy money. In fact, the state's making almost as much money from royalty payments as it is from taxes. We don't hear them talking about that because that's also being squirreled away and not used to reduce our taxes.
I would like to follow up on your comment then. Do you have something on your website or some documentation that this will cause more economic development in North Dakota?
We do. It was produced by the Beacon Hill Institute of Boston, Massachusetts. They're an econometrics firm that operate under the Suffolk University. This is an entity that the state of North Dakota itself has contracted with to provide studies. The tax department acknowledges they do not have the expertise or the tools to do this type of a study, and they've refused to commission one. We commissioned it. We've done one, and we're having an update prepared as we speak. So yes, there is a study out there, and in fact, econometric studies and economists all over the country acknowledge this, and so do our economic development agencies, and so does the legislature that approves the abatements because they result in additional income. So this takes care of itself.
I'd like to ask John, because you work with the chamber, what are your chamber members telling you?
Well, our chamber members, I think, one thing we need to, why the chamber's involved in all this is businesses thrive on predictability. With this measure, it throws our, like I said, it throws our tax policy into chaos. And exactly where these taxes are going to end up, if it's going to be corporate income tax is going to be raised, sales tax is going to be raised, personal income tax is going to be raised. Where that lands, nobody knows. And at the same time, this is it's not going to be something that's going to be solved in one session. You're talking of decades of work on this issue. So I think the main reason the chambers are involved is because businesses thrive on predictability. What this measure is creates chaos, and it's ill-advised.
I need to follow up, again, this is from our audience as well. For the proponents, your Beacon Hill report calls for the elimination of 11,908 public employees. How do you propose to continue a level of services that people have come to expect?
The Beacon Hill doesn't call for the elimination of 11,000 or 10,000 employees. What it says is the amount of taxes collected for property taxes would be the equivalent of funding that number of employees, but it does not call for the elimination. It was used in a compare and contrast to try to give perspective to the amount of money that property taxes raise.
Okay. Since Measure 2 states specifically that its effective date is January 1st, 2012, how would this measure, if passed, be implemented retroactively?
Well, keep in mind that it says that they won't be able to collect any taxes or assess any taxes after 2012. However, what's being collected right now this year was assessed in 2011. So it does not affect any taxes currently being collected. Additionally, it also says that in the first year, cities and local governments will receive the same amount of money that they are currently receiving in property tax. So in August, when they need to start their budgeting process, they already know that in January, they're going to get a check from the state equal to what their 2012 revenues were from property tax.
Would you like to respond?
Well, I certainly. There's one little secret, I guess, that isn't being necessarily talked about is how that retroactive date will affect some of these payment in lieu of property taxes. Production tax for oil companies are paid in lieu of property taxes. The Legislative Council will put some issues together and determine that maybe it will, maybe it won't. I can promise you, if I'm an oil company, I'm going to have my attorneys at the doorstep of the courthouse on June 13th, if Measure 2 passes, seeing what happens. That's a great sum of money from January 1, 2012 until June whatever of 2012. There's a great sum of money there that's going to be in play. And that's just one example of payment in lieu of property taxes. There are many other out there.
We are getting a lot of questions from our audience and from the phone. If you would like to weigh in on this too with a question, please dial the phone number that is on your screen right now. Please do. 667-3237 is that phone number to call. For the proponents, are things like libraries, senior citizen programs, historical societies, economic development, are they considered to be legally imposed obligations?
Go onto our website and click the button that will link you to the State Tax Department's guidelines for property tax. You will see right now you have a maximum of 4 mills that you can assess for your libraries. You will have a maximum of 2.5 mills that you can assess for emergencies, such as emergency snow removal or emergency services for tornadoes or whatever other disaster. That's the maximum. If you want a library that costs more than 4 mills, too bad. And so everything that's currently on that 27-page list from the State Tax Department that's currently funded by property tax will continue to be funded just by other sources other than your property taxes.
Would you like to respond?
Well, this is one of the biggest fictions about this full funding, because what you're talking about is, in my county, for example, we run about 18 deputies, and we have oil development in the western part. We are probably being barraged by requests for getting more deputies out there. So when they say fully fund legal obligations, what does that mean? Well, does that mean what we currently have 18 or needs to go to 22? And that will be decided by the legislature when you destroy local control of what is a full funding of local government. How many road blades do you need? How many paved roads do you have? All those things are going to be transferred to Bismarck to decide for your county, for your township, and that's why local control doesn't exist after this passes.
And just to add one more thing, is that that list of you know, what they've said is that list of the property tax department, those aren't legally imposed obligation. Those are maximums of what you can do. You don't have to you don't have to levy for a library. You don't have to do those things. If you want to, there's your maximum. So to say that everything that's on that list is going to continue to be funded, it's a fallacy.
Does anybody on the panel know what percentage of North Dakota residents are property owners? Does anybody have any figures on that?
The League of Counties put out a study, or they said that 16.7% of property is owned by non-residents. The claim of keep it local is as though if property tax, if Measure 2 passes, then they will pay no taxes. Well, that's not true whatsoever, because no one will pay property taxes at that point, and those are going to be picked up by probably increases, or actually increased revenues from sales and income tax without increasing the rates. So, and those people who own those properties are paying sales tax for the inputs, for maintaining the apartments, et cetera, that they own, and they pay income tax on their profits, exactly like you and I do. So it's a fiction when we say they're not paying them. Right now, quite frankly, the non-resident property owners are subsidizing the education of our K-12 kids. That's not fair either, but that's what's happening today. Tomorrow, they're going to still pay exactly what they're paying now and what we pay to maintain the properties.
Well, and just one more point to that is that 46% of all commercial property in North Dakota is out of state. Those are your big box stores, those are your commercial developments and things like that. Those people will be getting a free pass with this measure. And those are the people who rely on the roads, the fire and police protection for their businesses to run. And they won't have to pay into the services anymore. That'll have to be subsidized by you and me, by some other North Dakotans to pick up to cover those issues. So it just doesn't seem to make sense to me.
All right, this is a follow-up for the Keep It Local folks. And this is from the audience. If there is a shift in the tax burden to income and sales, why does that matter? We're already paying the taxes. With sales tax, non-residents can pay too. Why does this not help North Dakota?
Well, I think, again, it speaks to, it's your loss of local control is what we're talking about. You know, the money's going to come from somewhere. I think we can all agree on that. Somewhere the money's going to come from. It's the fact that you're willing to give up your local voice, your local elected officials. You're giving that up with this. And if you want to increase your income taxes and increase your sales tax on that, for that, I don't think it's worth doing that to lose your local control and lose your local voice.
Would the Empower the Taxpayer like to respond?
Yes, and I think we do need to address this, the big box stores. The fact is that nearly 50% of the properties don't pay property tax. That means that the biggest chunk of the property tax burden falls on a very small minority of people. And so when we talk about free pass, giving someone a free ride, it's already happening, and it's happening to about 50% of the property owners. Is this fair? And in the process, we are depriving people of their home ownership.
And that 50% that Charlene's talking about does not include our churches and those things that are property tax or exempt. This is properties that otherwise should be, that have been given special treatment and special exemptions.
This is for the Empower the Taxpayer. Supporters say there's $1 billion in waste by the legislature we talked about. Why should we then trust that the same legislature will suddenly stop wasting and prioritize local government over those, quote, wasteful priorities, end quote?
Again, because if they want to waste money now, it will require a tax increase. Right now, they're able to hand out these goodies to their special interests, to give all these, these great handouts to different groups, and with no repercussion, because they just keep on raising the property tax or raising other tax, or they've got all this surplus. We're saying now, instead of using that surplus and instead of raising property tax, you first fund the important stuff and fund K through 12, fund local government. Okay, then you want to still give out the goodies, fine. And if it requires raising taxes, then you're going to have to explain to your constituents why you had to fund a $55 million museum or a $250,000 racetrack commission or the study of shrimp at the expense of the homeowners.
Keep it local. Would you like to respond?
You have to put things in context here. First of all, 50% of the property owners are not free of taxes. That's a made-up number. That doesn't make any sense. What we're talking about here is sometimes, and I'll give my county as an example, my commissioners gave a 5-year tax break to Blueflint Ethanol to move into our county as opposed to going to Wyoming or Minnesota. And after that came off, we now have a multi-million-dollar piece of property that gets taxed. It created a bunch of jobs, and it created a local market for corn producers so they don't have transportation costs. So that 5 years that we weren't able to tax that provided long-term benefits, and now we have increased our tax base by using those tools. But it's a very small percentage of what happens. It's not, they're talking about the 2% they want to debate about when 98% of it is just straight-up property tax issues.
This will go for both proponents and opponents. In emergency situations such as a flooding across North Dakota, how will local counties and cities be able to respond if they don't have access to funding when they need it pretty much immediately? If the power folks would like to go
They do
first.
have access to funding, and it's a part of their basic budget. Every budget that's done by every county and city and every political subdivisions have reserves specifically to take care of those kinds of problems and issues. This is nothing new. It's always been done, and it's always reserved. In fact, counties statewide, we have McLean County has cash reserves that are 6 times their annual budget. If you take a look at the counties across the state, almost all of them have cash reserves that are between 60 and 75% of their entire annual budget. That's more than enough to take care of any emergency. Plus, the state has a general fund that it does to take care of those kinds of emergencies. Everybody's seen it. This is what happened when we had the snow last year. The money is already there. It's already provided for. It's already budgeted for. Nothing changes.
Give you a chance to respond, Mr. Erickson, because you are in Morton County. Or
McLean
in
County,
McLean
yeah,
yes.
that's not true. What we've done now, we sent out to the voters a request to build a new courthouse, which they approved, and we, a few years before, had to build a new jail. Our buildings were over 100 years old, and there were health problems in them. And because of that, we were able to get a coal impact loan, which is on our balance sheet as having in place, but that money is being spent as we construct the courthouse and other things. So it's not like we're sitting there with all this unspent money. They're not taking the debits that are going to be coming out of that. We are sitting, first of all, we're a very low tax county, but we are sitting at our mills, what we're allowed for emergency funds and no more.
And this kind of follows up on that too. The measure passes, the legislature meets, the legislature goes home in May or April of a year, and they have a big potash discovery. And all of a sudden, there's a lot more people coming into northwest North Dakota, and they have more needs. The legislature's not meeting for another 18 months. What do they do?
It's an interesting scenario, but if there's a potash fine, it's going to take 18 months to gear up to be able to start dealing with it. Also, the state of North Dakota literally has several billions of dollars in reserves. And when we're talking about infrastructure, let's remember one thing. Infrastructure is a capital investment. It's a long-term investment. Paying cash up front for it is not fair to the current taxpayers. It should be paid for over a period of years, 30 to 40 years. This is how you fund capital infrastructure. That's one of the problems they're dealing with in McLean County, or not a problem. It's not a smart way to fund. People should be paying for their infrastructure as they're using it. So 20 years down the road, the people using it in 20 years pay for it. We don't need to fund all this up front. This is how all of our infrastructure came into place when we first became a state, through bonding to pay for it over the long term.
I need to follow up, though. If you said that the state has reserve funds, but the legislature is not meeting, how do they tap into the reserve funds then?
They have interim committees that are set up to deal with those problems. They're already in place. They meet when they need to deal with those problems. It's already there. The method and the committees are in place to deal with those specific kinds of occurrences. It's in place now. How would it be done now? You know, you're not going to raise your property taxes in the middle of a year. You can't do that. So it's in place. I mean, it's not an issue.
I think some of the opponents would like to speak to this. I've seen that.
Well, this is one of the civics problems that makes no sense with this. First of all, interim committees do not have appropriation of power, and we would never want them to have that. First of all, there's very few citizens in this state that have representation on an interim committee that's doing something. And to say that an interim committee can start writing checks without the full legislature voting on it, without it going to the governor to sign, and through the normal due process that we use to develop legislation. We do have, and I think what they're confused about, is an emergency commission made up of elected state officials to deal with emergencies that come up between those sessions. But to expand that, to change our government to where we're going to have day-to-day, month-to-month requests and expenditures of public money without going through the process where you're not represented by your local people on those boards makes no sense.
Would you like to respond?
I would like to respond. When I say an interim committee, we're talking about the elected officials. These doesn't mean you don't have representation, and those elected officials on those interim committees, the committees have been set up, and these have already been appropriated for them to use their judgment to deal with emergency situations. It's there, it's in place, it's not unknown. If it were, if there was an emergency that happened today, they'd have to call into a special session. They don't have to do that, and they won't have to do that in the future if we don't have property taxes.
One more, since I gave them one response.
Yeah, it doesn't matter who's, you know, what I'm saying is your particular legislators may not be there from your area, but the bottom line is it's all irrelevant. Dave, none of those people have appropriations authority, and we will never let them have it. You have to have the full legislature decide the expenditures of state tax dollars.
This is also from the audience and for both proponents and opponents. Has property tax elimination ever been done elsewhere? If so, do you know what happened?
There are several counties in Alaska that do not have property tax. Iceland and England do not have property tax. There is no state in our country that has statewide no property tax. However, there are states who did at one time eliminate their income tax or their sales tax and were able to shift funding appropriately when they made that change. North Dakota went through a similar change back in the early 70s when we abolished personal property tax. That's right. You used to have your TV, your dishwasher, your shoes, your car taxed. We did away with personal property tax. At the time, there was all the scare tactics, sky's going to fall, and guess what? We came through it just fine, and I don't think there's a single person in this room that wants to go back to personal property tax and have to have someone come in and count how many TVs and radios you have in your home.
For the opponents, are you aware of anything?
Yeah, well, Iceland and England and those places have what's called a value-added tax. So when you go in and buy something there, you pay 17.5% to 20% sales tax to make up for what they don't charge in a property tax. There's no free lunch, and that's the problem here. If you want to change a system where people try to buy a car and there's a 20% or a 17% tax on it to make up for what's not being paid in property tax, that's the system or the direction this thing goes.
I have to ask both, and I have looked at it, and this has been given to us by some of the people who submitted questions in advance. There was a bit of a tussle about funding and using public dollars to influence this one way or the other, and I'd like to ask both, and I'll start with the proponents, where are your sources of money? And in the proponents' case, are you getting anything from the Jarvis Foundation of California?
We did receive a grant from the Jarvis Foundation while we were petitioning to help us pay for the expenses of the petitioning process. Since then, we have not received any funds from out-of-state organizations. Our funding right now is currently coming from in-state sources and they're $5, $10, $50 donations I think when we file next time, I think we might have 2 donations that top the $100 limit.
And for the opponents, where do you get your funding?
A great majority of our money is coming from our in-state organizations. If you look on the back of the pamphlet or go to our website, keepitlocalnd.com, you'll see that majority of our organizations we're North Dakota organizations. And we may be getting some national money from those organizations, but at the same time, those organizations represent many, many North Dakotans. I would strongly, again, suggest how many North Dakotans does the Howard Jarvis Foundation represent? A very, very limited few. So we're getting a majority of our money from our in-state organizations, and I think our records will show that.
Mr. Hill?
Keep It Local group doesn't keep its funding local. Of the $55,000 that they reported in the last reporting period, I think we reported $3,000. $35,000 of that came from the National Education Association. $10,000 came from the North Dakota Education Association. You should ask yourself why would those organizations, especially the National Education Association, and they've also told the Chamber of Commerce that they were going to pledge up to $5 million to defeat this measure. Why would they want to spend that much money to defeat it? Because if in fact this passes, you have school boards that now control 30% of their budget. If this happens, it's going to go nationwide. We've had calls from over a dozen states where groups are gearing up to try to get rid of their property taxes right now. They're afraid it's going to happen, and they're willing to put the money in to try to stomp it out now before it catches fire nationwide.
And I will give Keep It Local one more shot.
Well, first of all, I think the $3 to $5 million number is a completely made-up number from the proponents. At no point have we ever heard, or has that ever been a conversation in our organization or with NDEA? At the same time, again, why are these organizations opposing this measure? It's because property taxes fund schools. That's school funding. Of course, they're gonna support to defeat this, to protect their funding. But at the same time, again, the NEA represents many, many teachers across the state. Again, I'd go back to the fact that the Howard Jarvis Foundation just simply does not represent very many North Dakotans.
For the Keep It Local folks, again from our audience, are the companies from North Dakota that are funding Keep It Local currently paying property taxes at the same rate as homeowners do?
Well, again, I think it goes back to that abatement question we've had. I can't answer for every organization that has donated their exact property tax dollars. But again, with the abatement issue, that's a temporary issue. It's a temporary abatement that is caused to develop some economic development, it brings jobs into the communities, and it raises incomes, and it creates a bigger tax base. And at the same time, you're comparing business property taxes to individual property taxes, is comparing apples and oranges. It just doesn't. You can't compare them together. The business owners own property in that area, and at the same time, these businesses come in and they take risks, and they hire people, and they pay wages, and they do things, and they better their community. So, and giving them a temporary abatement has been shown to work. So I don't see the problem.
If you would like to respond, you could.
They're talking about that they work, and we agree they do work, and we believe it should work for everybody in this state. Everyone. If it's going to do what they claim, and in fact it does, the econometric studies say that it does, it's going to create an economy and a diverse economy so our kids can stay here. I got 4 kids. They're all well educated. They don't work here. They don't live here because there aren't any jobs for them here. I want that to change. And I think everybody should want to. The problem is, yes, members of this organization, i.e. the Chamber of Commerce, are getting huge property tax abatements. In fact, some of them are getting income tax abatements. I didn't learn until just a couple of weeks ago there are income tax abatements that are being given to businesses. When that happens, the burden falls back on the rest of us that don't get the special treatment. That's what's wrong with property taxes, is time it stops.
This is for both proponents and opponents. There are other things other than taxes. There are fees for things like hunting licenses, fishing licenses. Could the passage of Measure 2 cause those fees to go up?
There's no reason at all for those to go up because the hunting license, the fishing license goes specifically to the administrative costs of those departments. And keep in mind too, you know, again, they're talking about the benefit that communities derive from property tax abatements, from allowing businesses to be tax exempt for a period of 3 to 15 years. And if that works at that local, at that micro level, just imagine what it'll do for us statewide. Again, it'll pay for itself. Governor Schaefer said, we can do this without raising taxes. This isn't us saying it. This is the BHI, the Beacon Hill Institute study saying it. It's people who are in government who will say the same thing, that this pays for itself.
For the opponents.
It's very interesting that Governor Schaefer is brought into this. If you notice on the back of the book, there's a quote from Governor Schaefer, and it leads you to believe that he is supportive of this measure. As you'll come to find out on next week, there's a Fargo breakfast that's going to discuss this, and he's opposed to this measure. He's opposed to that, to his quote being used on the back of the book. So it just begs the question of, you know, where's the truth in all this?
And this is for both as well. What I'd like to ask this, and this has been discussed before in the legislature. There was a proposal.
We'd like to respond to that because he's
if you
claimed
could, then
that
I'll give them a chance
we're
to.
telling a lie. First of all, we're not claiming Governor Schaefer supports or opposes this measure. He's got questions about it. But he has told us that he sticks with the comment. The comment's true. This can be done without raising any other tax because he understands the econometric studies and impacts, as do the economic development agencies. In fact, I had breakfast with Governor Schaefer, and we specifically talked about this to make sure we didn't run into an issue on it. So I guess I'm a little bit troubled when that's the kind of thing that's put out here. The fact of the matter is it's true. Lloyd Omdahl does not support this measure either, but he is absolutely accurate when he says the evils of property taxes could fill a book the size of War and Peace. Those are true statements, and that's what we're using the statements for, is to prove points.
Give you one shot.
Well, we have to get a little bit in the weeds here because their study, which isn't an econometric study, it never says that anywhere in there, that's a policy study, and it says if you lay off 1,109 mostly state employees, that'll create $622 million in revenue. And that'll be 21% short of funding Measure 2 based on 2010 numbers. But there isn't 11,908 state employees. That's a problem. So you can't get rid of all the state employees. And so their numbers don't make any sense. And so when you consider the realities, then the only option is increasing all these other taxes. And to think that if we cut all these government employees, that we're going to somehow spur growth. Those models are based on being in a depression and trying to create lower unemployment. We are at the lowest unemployment in the country. So they're asking to increase our bubble when right now business and local government is all trying to find employees to work for us. And how can we afford to do that? And it's not the problems that were modeled in there. So it's a complete fiction that they've got a study that says this pays for itself.
I do want to get at the question I was going to ask, and this is in terms of a proposal that was made several years ago to cut down the number of school districts. Governor Sinner, I think, proposed to cut it down to 48. Just from both sides, is this going to give the legislature carte blanche to go to 48 school districts or less?
This question has been addressed at legislative interim hearings, and it was answered by the lead attorney for the Legislative Council, who said there is this does not affect consolidation of school districts. Again, we link that on our website, along with his statement that this affects very few of the payment in lieu of taxes that the state is currently receiving.
Please.
We don't know what would happen, and that's part of the problem. But here's the deal. This is what they're saying. Yes, Measure 2 doesn't mention payment in lieu of taxes, for example, but if it passes, the investor-owned utilities, for example, will be tax exempt. But the co-ops will be paying payment in lieu of. So they'll have an equal protection claim. And the legislature or the courts are going to have to address that. So now all of a sudden, you get rid of the first 5% of our oil money, which isn't in lieu of tax. And you get rid of the coal money, which isn't in lieu of tax. And you start dealing and reconciling all these in lieu ofs because we got rid of property taxes. You can't expect people to pay in lieu of property tax when there is no property tax. So now all of a sudden, the cost of Measure 2 is dramatically more than we're even talking about here.
All right, at this point, I'll give you about 30 seconds.
John Warford, the legislative council attorney that's, I think, been working for the state for 30 years, is the one that was asked to do the legal analysis of this. And he came through, he specifically said, the only in lieu of tax this will affect is the in lieu of tax on trees in the forests, and that's 50 cents per acre. Other than that, no in lieus will be affected by Measure 2.
30 seconds.
Well, see, that's right. On the paper, it doesn't affect it. That's just what I said. But it has to be addressed after it passes, if it passes, because you can't leave this disparity between businesses out there, some paying taxes and not, but they're in the same area. So there will be addressed to those issues, and it's huge dollars.
Unfortunately, the time has kind of gotten away from us. I would have had several more questions to ask you, but we need to wrap things up, so each side will get 2 minutes to wrap it up. So I'll start with the Empower the Taxpayer folks. You have 2 minutes.
Okay. Thank you again for the time to speak to you and answer these questions. And I hope it's been informative, and I especially hope that people will go to our website, because every single thing that we claim, we try to back it up with state documents, with studies, with facts, with hard facts. But keep in mind, the property tax is a vestige of the feudal system, where the king owned all the land, and you and the gentry and the nobility owned land at the pleasure of the king. And they paid for that pleasure in property taxes. Now, a little over 200 years ago, we fought a war of independence to be free of kings and to establish that all of us are free and equal people, to have full control of our property and our destinies and direct our lives the way we see fit. The one thing holding us back right now is property tax, that one last little vestige of the feudal system. Once we abolish property taxes, each one of us will be full property owners. We will be able to control our property and our futures the way we see fit. And yes, there's a lot of questions about what might happen, just as there were questions at the onset of the Revolutionary War. But we knew that freedom 225 years ago was important, and today it's important that we abolish property taxes.
Thank you. And now for Keep It Local, North Dakota.
Well, thanks again for hosting us. As you can see, a close examination of the facts reveals that Measure 2 does not stand up to scrutiny. Measure 2 supporters claim that our state can eliminate more than $1.6 billion in property taxes, but will not have to raise other taxes and fees to replace this revenue. They further believe that the state legislature can best decide what local projects need funding, and that this somehow strengthens local control. These claims are simply illogical. The Keep It Local Coalition is growing and is the largest public policy coalition in state history. We represent over 200,000 North Dakotans. This extraordinary coalition is comprised of business and labor groups, public and private sectors, urban and rural, Democrats and Republicans, conservatives and progressives, retired seniors and young professionals, teachers, farmers, police officers, firefighters, business executives, and small business owners. Measure 2 supporters say our coalition is a bunch of special interest groups. But take a look at our membership. I encourage you to look at keepitlocalnd.com. You will see a coalition that represents North Dakotans from all walks of life in every corner of our state. Our cause is not ideological, and it's far from radical. It's simple. It's about preserving local government, upholding your right to determine what's best for your community. Measure 2 puts the future of North Dakota at risk, and that's why it must be defeated.
I would like to thank our 4 panelists for a very spirited but civil discourse on this measure. This measure will be, of course, on the June primary ballot. A thank you to Dakota Media Access and the volunteers from the League of Women Voters for organizing the forum. Thank you to the viewers at home and the audience members here tonight for taking the time to learn more about the issues associated with Measure Number 2. This program will replay several times on Government Access Cable Channel 2, and will be available for online viewing at www.freetv.org in the days leading up to the June 12th primary election. Before we close this community forum, I want to remind you that voting in North Dakota is very simple, and you can find election and voting information at your county auditor's office. Thank you, and good night.